I'm Jonah Comstock, Editor-in-Chief at pharmaphorum. Across the European Union, approximately 300,000 patients depend on plasma-derived medical products, either for the treatment of a rare disease or for critical care use cases. These products can only be manufactured using donated human blood plasma. It's not possible to synthesize it. For this issue of Deep Dive, I sat down, virtually, with Giles Platford, president of the Plasma-Derived Therapies Business Unit at Takeda. I talked to Giles about Europe's shortfall of plasma, how it affects the country, and what can be done about it, especially when it comes to regulations about donation. I hope you find the conversation as edifying as I did.
Giles, thanks for joining me.
Great pleasure to be here with you, Jonah. Thanks for the opportunity to chat today.
So tell me a little bit about the situation here. There's a shortage of plasma in the EU. A lot of it's being imported from the US, and it's putting these plasma-derived therapies that are so necessary to so many people with rare diseases at risk, the manufacturing of them. Is that right?
Well, Jonah, thank you for raising this very important topic. So it's great, firstly, to see that the EU is reviewing the substance of human origin legislation, and it's such an important time. It's nice also to have the opportunity as an industry, together with other stakeholders, to input into what we think should be included in the legislative text to encourage, promote, enable, and empower EU member states to all do their part in ensuring sustainable supply of substances of human origin. In particular, in this case, we're talking about plasma. Now, plasma is the yellow straw-colored liquid that comprises about 50% of whole blood. And it has critical functions like fighting disease and clotting of blood. Now, patients who depend on plasma-derived therapies typically have rare, complex, chronic diseases. They need treatments for life. And they're suffering from conditions like primary and secondary immunodeficiencies, peripheral neuropathies, and blood clotting disorders. Now, in the EU, there are 300,000 patients who depend on plasma-derived therapies. And to give you an idea, a PID, primary immunodeficiency patient, will typically need about 120 donations per year to sustain their treatment. An alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency patient will probably need somewhere in the region of 900 donations per year. So this requires significant volumes of plasma to be sourced. Roughly 13 million liters of plasma are needed each year to supply these patients that depend on plasma-derived therapies, and still we're unable to meet the growing patient demand, in growing because of increased diagnosis, standards of care, improvements in access across the region. And to your point earlier, 40% of the plasma that's needed to support those patients is actually sourced from the US. So there is a deficit in Europe today, and this is why it's important that this legislation is being reviewed.
Right, because of course it's not as if we have a huge supply of plasma in the US either. So there's robbing Peter to pay Paul a little bit there, right?
Well, that's right. And I think the important thing to point out as well is that there is a global unmet need. And despite significant investments from Takeda and from other industry members to expand capacity, both in our ability to source plasma, but also our ability to manufacture that plasma, we're unable to keep up with global demand. And so, plasma that's being sourced today in the US and shipped to Europe, this could be used elsewhere around the world to address unmet patient needs. So it's really important that Europe plays its part in addressing that deficit and becoming more self-sufficient in plasma supply and supporting the needs of those patients that depend on plasma-derived therapies.
So what can the EU do from a regulatory standpoint? Are there regulations now in how these human substances of human origin are collected that create a blocker? Or is it more about just opening up more opportunities? What's in those proposed amendments, and what would you kind of like to see in there?
Well, I want to be clear that 60% of the plasma needed to support patients in Europe who depend on plasma-derived therapies does come from Europe. Half of that actually comes from only 4 EU member states where there is active private sector investment and involvement in sourcing of plasma, where public sector and private sector come together, and where the conditions are in place for this to happen in a sustainable way. And one of the things that the draft, the legislative text that we've seen so far does address, and we applaud this, is the difference between whole blood donations for transfusion versus plasma donations for fractionation. And it also recognizes the compatibility of compensation with the principles of voluntary unpaid donation. And equally, that some level of fixed rate allowance is reasonable and fair. And this is important. And those 4 EU member states that I referenced, they do allow, the regulations in those countries do allow a certain frequency of donation, between 20 to 60 donations per year for plasma donors, and do allow some level of fair compensation. That compensation is typically fixed at a rate that the local authorities determine. And Jonah, it's important to remember that, with that frequency and the time taken for plasma donors to go through plasmapheresis, roughly an hour, vis-a-vis whole blood donation, which is perhaps once or twice a year, maybe once a quarter for 15 minutes, this element of compensation is important.
Right.
So it's great that the legislative text addresses that. However, at the moment, we do feel it's a little too narrow because it says compensation for losses. And we do think it would be more appropriate to be allowing fair compensation for inconveniences and expenses incurred.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you dig into it, because of course these various laws that exist that prevent this compensation exist for a reason, right? You don't want like an open season of being able to buy and sell organs, body parts. Obviously, that leads down a very dark road very quickly. But at the same time, with something like plasma donation, it is such an investment of individuals' time that, and we all, for no matter what you do, your time is money. You could be doing something else with that time. One of those situations where you understand why there's regulations, but then when you look at the current reality, maybe they're a little too severe or they're having unintended effects.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Jonah. So obviously there's a natural concern that one doesn't want to be in a position where authorities or industry are seen to be incentivizing through monetary means donation of plasma or any other substance of human origin, and certainly not to the extent that that would jeopardize the safety of the donors themselves. And this is another area of the legislative text that we would like to see further improvement. The legislative text draft currently states that plasma donation infers significant risk. Now, there's no data out there that we are aware of that would give any proof to that. In fact, there's a wealth of data out there that shows even at pretty high levels of frequency of donation. And remember, in the US, plasma donors can donate twice a week. That's upwards of 100 times a year, should they choose to. And there's a wealth of data out there that shows that even at higher levels of donation frequency and with compensation, which is allowed as well in the US, the level of adverse reactions recorded amongst donors is somewhere in the region of 0.16%, which is very consistent with whole blood donation. And these are typically very mild adverse reactions. And the other thing I would state is that from a patient perspective, with all the steps that are taken to screen for healthy donors, sample and test each individual donation, inactivation steps in manufacturing, both chemical and process, and all other systems that are in place to monitor very carefully deferral and frequency of donations, it's not only safe for the donors, it's also safe for patients. And we haven't seen any case of blood-borne viral exposure in more than 3 decades. So I think there's enough proof points out there to show that, A, with appropriate regulation, which can be determined locally around frequency of donations, and B, with some level of fair compensation for inconvenience and expenses incurred, we can ensure sustainable and safe supply of plasma.
So this is something I got into a little bit with Christina Alec-Metz when I talked to her for our podcast, but it seems like solving this problem long term, the real holy grail would be to have some kind of synthetic plasma or some way of generating it other than donors. Is there anything like that on the horizon technologically, or is it just too intractable of a problem?
Well, one of the challenges, Jonah, that makes plasma-derived therapies unique is that they can only be made from plasma, which can only be sourced from healthy human donors, and there are only so many donors out there, and we rely on the generosity and time dedicated from the millions of donors around the world that do contribute. But as of today, I mean, these proteins can only be extracted from plasma, and they are often the only treatments available to these patients that are deficient in those proteins to appropriately replace them. Now that they're replacing, there are some disease areas where plasma-derived therapies play an active role in the treatment paradigm, where recombinant therapies are coming through. And of course, we welcome and encourage any innovation that's going to be good for the patients that we serve. And we've seen some cases where recombinant therapies have come through, they have been successful, and this is fantastic. And it also relieves some of the burden on plasma supply globally. But in case of immunoglobulins, which are obviously one of the most important plasma-derived therapies and most broadly used for primary and secondary immunodeficiency patients, as well as some peripheral neuropathy disorders like CIDP, there really aren't suitable alternative treatments today, particularly for PID, primary immunodeficiency patients. So we need to continue to invest in sustainable sourcing of plasma, in expanding capacity to fractionate and purify and commercialize that plasma so that it can be accessible to patients around the world.
What's the worst case scenario with these shortages? Is it just a matter of sort of new patients won't be able to get onto these therapies, or is there a risk the patients who are on a treatment regimen now might have to change to something else or cut back or something if there isn't enough plasma to make the drugs that they need?
Well, we're in a situation today, Jonah, where there are occasions where, particularly during the pandemic, and I think this heightened awareness around the importance of supply chain sovereignty and sustainable supply, where Takeda and our industry peers have been in a very delicate position where we've had to make sensitive decisions around allocation of a constrained volume of supply, and particularly for these immunoglobulin therapies that I've spoken to. And there are cases in parts of the world where patients are not able to get access, and it does have a significant effect on their quality of life and their risk of exposure to viruses. And sometimes these patients end up sick and very sick and quite frequently. And so it does have a significant impact to their lives. And so we're very careful that as and when patients go on to one of our treatments, that we make a firm commitment to sustain supply of therapy to those patients. Is one of the most important criteria we have when we're allocating supply to different countries, in a constrained situation. We also consider the contribution that those countries make to the global supply of plasma. That's very important as well. And also the commitments we've made to governments through tender contracts and so forth, those come into consideration. But it's critical that for those patients who dearly depend on these treatments, that we continue to collaborate, public sector, private sector, other stakeholders, to ensure that sustainable supply of plasma is there. And that's where this SOHO legislation at European level, whilst not prescriptive in nature, plays a very important role in encouraging, promoting, enabling, and empowering EU member states to do their part in a way that makes sense for them, with regulations around frequency of donations and appropriate compensation for donations, that makes sense for them to do their part in addressing that deficit in plasma supply today that exists in Europe.
Is there anything we haven't discussed yet that you want to talk about, or anything you want to emphasize or reiterate?
I would just take the opportunity to thank you again for having this platform today to speak with you on this very important topic. We're excited to see this legislation at European level being reviewed. We welcome some of the changes that we're seeing to the text around appropriate fair compensation for plasma donors, and we want to make sure that also that text recognizes that plasma donation is safe, and with the appropriate regulations promoting private sector and public sector collaboration, we can work together to contribute to improving sustainability of supply of plasma for these patients in need. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Great. Thank you so much, Giles, for joining us.